Welcome to Funnel Reboot, the podcast that shares ideas on how to upgrade your lead generation. Here is your host, Glenn Schmeltzley.
Hey, Glenn here. Welcome to Funnel Reboot. Today we're diving into how the worlds of communication and psychology inform marketing. First, I want to say a big thanks for the Marketing Books episodes that you've been listening to. I'm really glad, with the help of these authors, to hold a book giveaway. And if you're hearing this before the end of April 2022, you can get in on it. All you have to do is post something on Instagram or Twitter or LinkedIn, and please use the hashtag marketingbooks, all one word. I'm going to keep drawing names for any people that I see that use that hashtag, and I will be contacting you after Saturday, April 30th to let you know that you've won in the draw. And I'm going to keep drawing names until I give all the books away. On to today's episode. It's been amazing what we've achieved by connecting up computers worldwide, webbing them together. As its full name suggests, we gave ourselves this internetwork of computers, a way to provide every piece of information we could ever need on command. So that's what we've done in making the internet. But there's one change that the internet has made to us. It gave us more stimulus than our natural biology was ever made to handle. The demand for our attention then suddenly exceeded the supply. And this explains an economic shift that's most noticeable in the world of advertising. In that time, the digital advertising marketplace has gotten more vast, more confusing, and it's now far less clear what the rules are anymore. Thankfully, there's been a lot of research at the intersection of advertising and human attention. Effective marketers who are aware of the trends can tune their advertising to make their brands heard and win the attention of their target audience. And I wanted to get some of these latest insights. So I'm talking to the author of the book, Paid Attention, which just came out in the beginning of 2022 with a revised edition. Its author grew up in the UK, and after graduating from Oxford University, led the digital innovation efforts at global ad agencies like McCann Erickson and MDC Partners. Following that, he and his wife Rosie co-founded Genius Steals, an innovation and strategy consultancy. He also serves as a juror for marketing awards like the Clios and the London International Awards. He's also been a member of a non-profit consortium called the Attention Council, whose aim is to better measure the influence of marketing on people's attention. Clearly, this is someone who likes the written word, and in addition to writing his books, he puts out a monthly column in AdMap and on the Marketing Society. Please join me to welcome Faris Yakob. I'm very pleased to have Faris Yakob. Welcome to the show, Faris.
Thanks for having me, Glenn. It's nice to be here.
I'm really glad to. And we are about to jump into a book. It's called Paid Attention, Innovative Advertising for a Digital World.
Yeah.
And this book originally came out a few years back, but the second edition just came out in 2022, which is when we were recording.
Yeah.
Is that right? That's okay.
Yeah. The original edition came out.
Tell me about the origin of the book. What led to it?
Absolutely. Well, so I've been working in advertising in and around different parts of the industry in different markets also for 10, 15 years. And a big part of that during that process of me finding my voice and finding my, set of beliefs about how everything worked was writing about it. So to begin with, that was blogging in the sort of early planning blogging wave in the mid-noughties, where I met a lot of other people who were interested in some of the same questions and were thinking and writing about them quite regularly. And so I was writing a lot, and I had spent a bunch of time thinking about a book and wanted to try and pull things together, try and find a cohesive thesis. But I was also working full time, which made that hard. I know people tell you those amazing stories of waking up at 4 a.m. before their kids and hammering away at the couple of chapters and stuff. I didn't have that ability when I was working. I didn't even have kids. But so when I stopped, I managed to get a bit of time to think and some emotional energy and sort of compile everything. And attention had been a big part of how I thought about what was developing, kind of the difference between what we actually did and what we were trying to do. There's like a level of abstraction between the implementation of advertising and what we think it's doing, a sort of thing. And I found that very interesting. And as I began to explore it more, kind of the idea of attention, it became clear to me that it was foundational to the entire edifice of advertising. That means everything we do is about attention, essentially. Because, at its very basic level, advertising derived from advertere, the Latin for attention grabbing, getting attention for something. That's what advertising literally is. In the kind of common sense and dominant communication cascade model, which we call AIDA, attention is the A at the beginning. Some people think it's awareness. That came later. It's not. Awareness is the thing we can measure. Attention is the actual thing we're looking for. And in media terms, we buy and sell human attention in aggregate through proxies, which we call impressions primarily. It's a sort of currency designed to allow us to broker attention as an industry. So it felt like that was a really important theme. And I guess over the last few years, the reason my publisher suggested I update the book, beyond the fact that obviously it's designed to help you sell some more copies, which is, transparently, that's part of why you update these things, is because the discourse in advertising about attention had suddenly it felt like it was suddenly a lot more salient than it was when I was first publishing this book. So the idea of parts of the opacity of the digital media marketing buying chain, part of the confusion of choices and so on. Suddenly people were talking about attention both in media terms and in creative terms, and it felt like a great opportunity to collate some of my new thinking about attention and the new research that I come across that sort of begins to put flesh and practical bones on some of the kind of higher level concepts I think I was working with originally.
That's great. I agree with you. I would say that to have come out with your first edition explaining that, you were probably at the very early end of an idea that I guess has been popularized. There are people like Tim Wu. I would also point to Mark Schaefer and maybe Matthew Sweezy, who have also, pointed out that while publishing and the ability for brands to become publishers in their own, media entities, that's grown logarithmically, but attention has stayed finite because, of course, each of us has, only so much bandwidth. So this dynamic here, but you begin the book by explaining, all right, that means that there has to be a fundamental shift in how brands decide to portray themselves, because it's not the same old game anymore. And you start off with, I think, a very strong punch with this short little, phrasing saying brand is myth, logos are logos, and advertising is literature. So do you want to maybe boil that down a bit for us? Because that's a mouthful.
Yeah, agreed. And so part of what I was thinking is that, just what happens, this is the world of remote recording. Yes, absolutely. So brands as myth structures, I basically moot the idea that, and this is an idea that's sort of coming out again, and we can discuss that, I think, with the sort of work from Orlando in Look Out, which just came out. But the idea that as a society, we kind of pursued one part of our identity, kind of the rational, practical, scientific part, which is called logos in kind of the Greek split of the world, which is ironic. And the alternative being mythos, basically. Mythos is what gives life meaning. It's the stories that allow us to understand who we are, that help us understand how we interact with humans and all that stuff. And that part of society kind of has declined dramatically, both in terms of religion and other kinds of cultural myths, which I think you can see happening now as for example, national myths are resurging aggressively in a kind of backlash to that, if you see what I mean.
Yep.
So part of my thesis was that brands take the place of some forms of myth structures in modern capitalist consumer societies. So we use them to tell stories about ourselves to ourselves, and to tell stories about ourselves to other people, and to find tribes. And that's sort of what myth structures help us do, provide meaning, essentially, right? So that's why logos led us to logos, which is, I get obnoxious framing, but I liked it a lot. And what was the last piece of it? Hang on.
Advertising is literature.
Yeah, okay. So if you grant me that brands are myths, brands are not ads. What are ads then? Ads are stories that are told from myth. So in the classic kind of anthropological understanding of myth, which is sort of back to Levi Strauss, the anthropologist, not the genes people.
You're right.
Yeah. So he said that the function of myth in society is to help reconcile contradictions that we experience in everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
So imaginatively reconcile them. So the most obvious being religion begins to exist often because we realize that we're alive, and that at some point we're not going to be. And that's a contradiction we can't reconcile. If you like, there's a piece by Damien Hirst, the modern British artist. It's a big shark in a big glass tank, and it's called The Impossibility of the Idea or Conception of Death in the Mind of the Living. That's what he's talking about, right? So, but these contradictions occur everywhere in our life, and you can sort of resolve them imaginatively because they're not things that can be fixed. They're paradoxes to be managed. That's part of the human condition.
Sure. If we look at a consumer, I mean, the easiest way to think about this, more at a day-to-day level than a existential level,
Sure.
It would be I currently am dissatisfied with the state I am in.
Yeah.
And I want to picture a future state where I am satisfied.
Yeah. Totally.
And advertising just plunks right into that moment,
right,
and explains that. That's the literature. That's the little hero journey.
Right, exactly. So you dramatize aspects of the myth. So the thing about myth that makes them unique is that you can retell them in different ways again and again. And as long as the core components of the myth are still there, it's the same myth. So you can retell a brand story in an infinite number of ways, designed on what you're trying to achieve and the culture and the time.
And from extremely large, we think epic length poems down to a 15-second spot or a 7-second interactive banner ad.
Yeah. And that's a big part of it, right? There's a whole compression thing occurring. And that's what led people to think that attention spans might be decreasing, which is obviously a thing I try and dismantle as a myth in the new part of my book. But that myth came out later.
Right. So maybe let's jump perpendicular to that point of the consumer being a person who is requiring these things to fit into a mythos. I think one thing you slag is maybe the 20th century idea of cheapening them down to just an impression, cheapening them down to being a consumer segment. One little snippet that I read that really jumped out with and this is speaking directly to brands, how are they to influence purchase behavior, drive loyalty, and develop and maintain a price premium? Yep. The problem with traditional models is they focus on the transmission of the message to consumers. And despite protestations of putting consumers at the heart of this process, it ultimately only considers the needs of the brand to the publisher. It's like the consumer is an afterthought that just gets, pegged into a cohort of other consumers like them, who watch that particular show at that particular time on that particular evening.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's part of the challenge. When you examine humanity at scale, our brains don't understand humans at scale very well. Famously, Robin Dunbar pointed out that about 150 relationships are the most your brain can manage. That's actually part of a concentric circle model where you get about 1 to 1.5 truly deep, close friends, probably a partner and some change. Few really close friends, 4 or 5. Anyway, it expands out. Beyond that, we find it really hard. And that we can see that in terms of social media, where you have thousands and thousands of friends on social platforms, and that doesn't mean the same thing it used to, definitely, right? Okay. Understanding humans in like spreadsheet terms it makes it easy to abstract away from the human part. And so empathy is very difficult when you look at things at massive scale through spreadsheets. And ultimately, brands exist, companies exist to make money. This is a capitalist endeavor, right? But I guess my thesis is that there's predatory ways of doing it, and there's ways that are mutually beneficial. And ultimately, what I want to move towards is a mutually beneficial relationship between consumers, advertising, and the media entities that provides a kind of healthier ecosystem for everybody. I guess that would be great.
It would be, and yet our luckless and hapless marketer is still wading through a little bit. I mean, the internet has thrown a massive curveball into what they're planning to do. That spreadsheet has gotten much larger. You mentioned that, unfortunately, if we were to go back to the media buying that might have been taught in school, it would be, well, just have a column that says impressions and total them. Yeah. But you point out not all impressions are created equal. So, explain to me a little bit more of, let's dwell on just how painful this is. We'll get to, prognosis later, but let's kind of complete the diagnosis of the problem here.
Totally fine. So first of all, at a kind of purely conceptual level, which is where I like to start most things, before you get into advertising as a human being, you intuitively understand that seeing an ad in a newspaper and watching an ad in the cinema are quite different experiences that seem quite different to you, right? But when you get into media planning, like I first started out as a media planner, and you learn what an impressions is and how reach and frequency work. All impressions are fungible, or if you like, fungible, because Americans say fungible.
Sure.
But I think fungible. But anyway, all impressions have to be, for it to be a currency, they have to be a self-similar thing. You can compare numbers. Yep. This gives you more, this gives you less, which is inherently wrong, right? It's a misunderstanding, except it's a necessary one for trading.
It's a simplification.
Right, exactly. And when I worked at Naked, I started at Naked very early. Naked sort of existed essentially to try and help solve this problem, where the bifurcation of the industry into creative and media had left them both kind of slightly disconnected from the other part of the system. And those of us that had been both sides kind of felt that, So we were trying to do apply qualitative insight and strategic kind of creativity to media thinking. That was kind of the big part of original Naked idea, right? So at that level, it's important. And then, so it's kind of what's the strategic aspect, and how do people consume these impressions differently is really important to my mind. So to use the same example, in a cinema, when you're watching on a very large screen in a dark room with your phone supposedly off, you have quite a lot of attention pre-captured by the context. So the ads themselves don't need to do a lot of attention catching work, if that makes sense, because a lot of that's done for you. Whereas a billboard's entire job is to catch attention. Because no one's actively looking at a billboard in a dark room, you're going past it quite fast in a car or look or whatever. So they're different media, obviously, and they need to be understood and used differently because of that, which is why putting the same thing in every place is bad communication strategy,
Yes, and that trying, like you said, on the media planning side, to boil it down to, let's say, cost of that spot, let's say it's a YouTube ad, divided by number of seconds for which they saw it. This is not the calculus. This is going the wrong way. You point out that an ad isn't meant to be just taken, and looked at or viewed. It's supposed to be absorbed. You said just as a capsule is not meant to be tasted, but to be swallowed, right?
I think that was either Howard Gossage. I think it's Howard Gossage that wrote that. Maybe. I'm pretty sure, but
But on that point, and I found it rather interesting in the way that you explained this. You're going for a depth of engagement, how much are you lighting up the internal makeup of that person by what they are seeing. You even claim that things like art installations can be advertisements, and that can be looked at, if you're trying to justify the investment, as things that will, as I said, light that spark within someone. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be along a line of seconds in duration or, number of eyeballs. Tell me more.
Sure. So media's job is to get the right thing in front of the right people. And what we used to get taught was the right person at the right time with the right message, right? What that led to was an idea of essentially direct response stalking people, because to your point, the data set that digital gives you in terms of impressions allows for extremely large algorithmic optimization opportunities. When you've got loads of numbers, you can use the software to optimize, which means you get a little bit more juice out of your media, right? But we know from Nielsen's, Catalina research, and generally, I think, is that a significant, if not the majority portion of the impact of advertising is creative, about 50%. The rest is brand, media, context, and so on, right? Whether or not that's exactly right is irrelevant. Creative has its own job to do, because if I get something in front of you and people hate it, then that's not great. Now, it's not entirely accurate. Okay, hang on. I would argue that usually likability is the strongest predictor of advertising effect. They did a bunch of meta-analyses about this. So likability as a pre-testing measure is usually the best pre-testing measure. Do you like it? Very simply. Not do you remember it? What's the message take out? Just do you like it? Because I think Paul Feldwick's 2 new recent books are about this to some degree, and they're very good. Entertainment is sort of the cost of entry to someone's brain.
Yeah.
If I don't want to watch it, my brain's going to ignore it. And so it's like, you can also, however, at the other end of the spectrum, really annoying advertising can also work. Irritation advertising is successful. Insurance companies use it. It can be a good strategy depending on the need. But ultimately,
would negative sentiment be also in that? If you remember hating it.
Yeah, if it's really annoying, I think it's high. So like insurance companies tend to run like the campaigns insurance work on a high frequency designed to remind you, because you make a decision once a year.
Yeah.
And so whichever brand is most in your head is basically what you're going to Google, Geico or whatever's in your market,
whether it's a nice reason or not.
Yeah. And the Geico ads are very pleasant. The UK has had a number of very successful campaigns. I think it was called Go Compare, which was an insurance aggregator with a Italian opera singer who sings Go Compare in various weird situations. Okay. It was rated the number 1 most annoying ad in the country.
Sure.
But it also was very effective. However, I don't think we should be aiming for annoying. I think that's not aspirationally what we want. Right. So I think those are the bits, right? So media's got a job to do, creative's got a job to do. I think they work better when you think about them together.
Yep.
Yeah.
Very true. When you get into, those ways that you're trying to touch something from within, I guess we're circling back into this. It's myth. It is, touching something that someone wants to. And I think one thing that you call out pretty starkly is that advertising people themselves, vendors, agencies, had better watch and not have the hubris to think that they can get into this. You say that the longer you work in the field, you're far less like the average person that you're trying to attend to with this advertising, right? And so you may not be the best judge.
Right. So, 2 things. I think whatever you do for a living, if you do it all the time and such, or for a long time, becomes kind of a metaphor or lens through which you absorb the world. That's sort of impossible to avoid, I think. It's just, you're thinking about something all the time. Your brain is changing as you do that. And then the world looks like, So what I'm like for a creative director, I think one of the great things that really powerful creative directors do is they have an intuitive sense developed over years of what will emotionally activate human beings. The ones that are really good can do that, and they can do it consistently over time. I think it's very challenging as a planner to be the voice of a consumer if you've been inside the industry for decades, because you don't consume advertising in the same way as normal humans, in a very specific and fundamental way. The example I often use is if walking along the subway in America or in London or in New York, the underground, there's ads everywhere. Right. Now, when I see ads everywhere, I look from ad to ad. I want to see what's going on, what brands are doing what they're trying to do, what the strategy might be. It's how I consume advertising. Normal humans just walk by them. They do not do that.
Right.
Straight by. So that's why we need a bit of research. And I have some issues with research as well, but it is really important because we need to validate our intuition with people who aren't inside baseball, I guess.
Yes. The example you gave that laid it out for me was, imagine that there is a high publicity trial. Now imagine I'm a news junkie. Okay, so I walk in front of the selection, the lawyers and the judge, and they're asking me questions. Well, of course I've heard of the suspect, and of course all right, well, you're not a valid juror. What?
It's challenging, isn't it? It's because, and the way ad people specifically and journalists consume media is quite distinct from how the rest of the world seems to en masse.
Which you only realize when it's pointed out to you, because it happens so slowly. You don't recognize that.
Yeah. And that's why we do. I mean, that's why research is so important. We want to develop our intuition over a career by doing stuff, seeing if it works, and then incorporating that into our mental model for what we do. But equally, we don't want to fool ourselves that we're the same as the people we're trying to talk to.
Yeah. And I think another thing that we do on, not so much on the creative side, but on the placement side, is we will, it's a regression to the mean with, again, this spreadsheet of impressions. We will tend to think, if I am putting let's say a visual inside of a publication website, that may be tantamount to the print or maybe in-person media that is being presented to my target audience, without remembering that as that person is, let's say, walking into that event space and there is a 30 by 30, contraption with the logo on it, that's not at all the same with something that's in the corner of a little screen that they're looking at on a laptop. Right. They're not the same.
No, and there are some issues with how viewability is currently measured online, because viewability size on screen is not part of viewability measurements at the moment, which means you can have 100% on screen. It's just that very, very small.
Without even mentioning that some of the intermediaries or the actual platforms themselves do not have an incentive to make it viewable to the end user, because that's not necessary for them to get paid.
Well, now we have yes. So Cory Doctorow wrote about this. He calls it the inherently toxic relationship between media consumers and publisher and advertisers. And part of it is very understandable, which is just that digital things are easy to change, and therefore advertisers rightly want third-party verification or media ratings for their digital things, which creates this infrastructure of intermediaries, ad serving and ad tracking, and then verification now increasingly so, to sort of show that actually did happen. But there is obviously...
You want numbers? I'll give you numbers.
There's a lot of programmatic fraud and opacity in the buy chain. We know that, right? According to a forensic analysis by PwC in the UK, there's a 15% delta on all digital media spend that they cannot track. They can't find it. And they're forensic accountants. They're like, where did this money go? We don't know. And that's quite a lot of money. And it's an interesting situation. But I think, again, this is because we pushed really hard into algorithmic optimization. I've got a number, make that number more efficient, make it bigger for cheaper. And the algorithm will do that. They'll find a way to do it, or the agency or the buyer or the DMP or the DSP will find it. Yeah. But the cheaper the impression, the less contextually relevant it's going to be. And I think context is important. I've always thought context was important. I was a media planner. That was basically the job, I thought, understanding resonance and what brands did and what placements did beyond impressions. So newspapers give you certain kinds of stature. Different newspapers are different, however. That kind of thinking. When audience buying came out as a concept, programmatic, someone very excitedly described it to me. And I'm like, you're just stripping context away from communication. Finding the same audience somewhere else isn't the same audience, I don't believe. And that's why I think we push too hard into optimization, because I think modality matters. Where I see something affects how I think about it, and how I'm consuming and when I'm consuming affects it too. It's super important.
Yes. And so you have thankfully taken us through to giving some actual suggestions and models for us to think about. It would have been easy to just, finish the book while, just bashing other current modes. But yes, to this point about not all impressions are created equal, you point out that if we think about it, and this is the bargain for the reader is that you have to spend some more time thinking and getting research about it before you do it. But if you're into this and you really want it to work, this is what it takes. But you suggest a pyramid. Can you tell us about the pyramid of impressions?
Absolutely. So it's based on, I guess, personal insight that I then informed. So this is before the pandemic, but it obviously got accelerated during it. I consume too much Twitter. I consume a great deal of Twitter. It's my dominant media consumption channel by far. And, I didn't feel great always. And I was like, I don't think that's good. And so I looked into some of the research, and there's a couple of bits that I used to build it. One, which is there is a bunch of research in different media consumption areas about reported psychological well-being after the consumption of said media. Yeah. And there are duration effects in place here, which are important too. So based on in mature media markets, we have basically what I call peak attention, which is to say media consumption has been growing a lot all of the time because new media keeps appearing, and that's very exciting, right? Yes. But to your point earlier, there is a finite human capacity for consuming media. We consume, according to Nielsen in America, although obviously right now Nielsen's having some troubles with its measurement and accreditation in various ways, which is a fascinating moment. This hasn't happened in generations. The chance for rethinking media measurement is genuinely real right now for the first time in a very long time, in my opinion. Very exciting.
Disruption is here. Yes.
Yeah. Getting iSpot on the measurement thing for NBC is a huge deal. It's a massive. Anyway, wait, what was I saying?
Just about the pyramid and we lead from, we begin with the
so there are attention effects.
Yeah, the peak attention.
So basically, first of all, consuming 1 to 2 hours of social media a day tends to make you feel better upon self-reporting. But after that, it declines. If you doom scroll for 6-8 hours on any social platform, at the end of it, you tend to feel worse. So I was like,
it's toxifying.
Yeah, exactly. Let's try and think about how we allocate our consumption. So as I said, mature media markets, media consumption plateaus at a certain point because there's no more time in the day. In the US, 12 hours and 4 minutes or so. In the UK, it's slightly lower, but it sort of stops, which means you can think about it as a complete amount of media to allocate to your day, right? So I took the idea from the food pyramid, the old American FDA kind of.
Got it.
And what I like about that model is it's really simple to understand. First of all, hilariously, it's not a pyramid. It's a triangle, clearly, which I always found hilarious. Anyway, I call mine the media pyramid anyway. It should be the media triangle. But to follow in footstep of the idea to make sense, right? At the top, things at the top are bad for you, so you should consume the least of them. Things at the bottom are good for you, so you should consume the most of them. It's a very simple model shape, and I like that. To my mind, things at the top are toxic. So there is media that exists entirely to fabricate things in order to sell snake oil. And I mean things like InfoWars, Breitbart, and I mean Goop as well, where they say things that aren't scientifically rigorous or in some cases outright lies, and they use it to sell things. And I think those things are toxic. I don't think it's healthy for you as a media consumer to eat a diet completely made of untruths because it stops you thinking about the world in the right or useful way. So that's bad. We shouldn't consume it if we can avoid it. Social media on this sort of thing is pretty good. It makes you feel connected. A media pyramid was an idea I kind of created for myself originally to try and think about balancing my media diet. I personally consume a great deal of Twitter. I love Twitter, but I wanted to balance it because after a while, I began to notice that hours of scrolling or what became doom scrolling during the pandemic weren't making me feel good. So I looked into some research about the reported psychological well-being impact of media consumption and the duration effects thereof. So the pyramid was built around trying to avoid media that I think is toxic, i.e. media that lies to you for specific exploitative purposes. Often I've noticed to sell you fake supplements, regardless of the politics of your disinformation site. A lot of them make money, it seems, through selling supplements and such. I don't think that's good. People shouldn't do it. And we shouldn't consume information that is designed to give us a false impression of the world or make us angry. I mean, that's not healthy. A bit of social media a day is generally quite good for you, according to the research. It makes you feel better, connected. There's a bit of dopamine in there. But if you do it for more than a couple hours a day, you tend to feel worse over time. So then it made sense to me to say, if we're going to consume 12 hours of media a day in America, according to Nielsen, of that 12 hours, let's not spend more than a couple at most on the social. And then what's better for you is media where you have a sense of agency. There's a great deal of research that shows the more agency you have in your media consumption, the more you tend to feel good about it afterwards. So if you're being fed algorithmically, you're watching broadcast TV and grazing whatever comes on next, you'll feel less good than if you chose to watch certain shows or read certain things, let's say.
Yeah.
Then there's media like, magazines that are blessed in the sense of they tend to be interest based and they don't have notifications when you're reading them. I mean, paper magazines were a massive beneficiary of the pandemic. Subscriptions were up 40-50%. Now, a lot of the time people didn't want to leave the house, of course, but it's, I think, partially because the media environment of a magazine is quiet and they're not getting pinged all the time. And then down at the bottom, so I mean, I think podcasts are actually a very, again, also a really interesting medium because people find peace and quiet and strong relationships in them. There's a great deal of, relationship between podcasts. I mean, my favorite podcast, Adam Buxton, no offense, it's a great podcast, Glenn, but I love Adam Buxton. I have a great, I feel like I have a strong parasocial relationship with him. And I think that's part of what we lose when we think about media transactionally, perhaps, is that there's something in that relationship which has value and that brands want access to, So,
yeah, absolutely. I think it's possible. I mean, personalities are a wonderful way to do it. I love your mention of parasocial. You mentioned that even, if we think of large Super Bowl ads, there are ways that they have tried to up that engagement to basically, you call it reversing the polarity of where the attention is going. Tell me more about that.
So increasingly, when you look at media holistically, I say, and you realize that there's a digital plumbing that's going to be applied to all media, you can think of media as one large system of things, which means you don't need to think of them as like the same thing everywhere, but how the pieces interact to me is interesting. So when social media emerged, humans developed the ability to publish, to make public. Yep. For the first time. And that is actually a huge deal, obviously. This is why social media is such a big deal, because previously it was TV stations, media companies, governments, advertisers. Publishing was a privileged act. It cost money. It was difficult. Then we all started doing stuff, publishing, becoming public, And because of that, it occurred to me and to lots of people pretty quickly that you could make ads the other way around by pulling, let's say simply, tweets into billboards. Very early on when Crispin was doing that, tweets on billboards, tweets into banners, by using real humans' words and putting that at scale, something different seemed to happen. Like it's not quite a testimonial, it's not an endorsement, it's more like a real thing, So thinking about how instead of, the industry historically goes TV and then down from TV, right? And, I know we pretend we don't anymore, but like a lot of the time we still do a bit.
One main mouthpiece or megaphone out.
Exactly. And then how do you flesh that out or, expand a campaign around that concept? Whereas, you could think about starting elsewhere, I think. And I feel like humans like attention as much as brands do. And there's some value in putting humans in various different ways into ads. And then you get like fake versions of that appearing. As soon as that idea becomes a thing, you get like reality advertising, I call it. So it's like, either the experiments where they reveal it's a pizza or it's a Febreze, which is the first bit. And then you get the even more fake ones where they're real people looking at this car coming out of the ground in a big warehouse. And you're like, I don't think they're real people. I mean, they are real people. Everyone's they're not software. They're not deep fakes. I mean, they are actors. But they might not be.
And we read that. Yep. No, we read that. But when it's user-generated content, and we have to trust, but when they attribute it to a person, and we can go and look at that person's Twitter profile, or we can, we were in the same, let's say, closed community where that person suggested it. We have kind of a provenance. We start to all of a sudden place much more heft on that because our mythos and their mythos are overlapping.
Yeah, and advertisers seek something called authenticity a lot. Since the very beginning of my career, this has come up a lot as a topic of conversation. But being authentic as a giant multinational corporation is acting like a giant multinational corporation. That's what being authentic is for you. It's not like pretending to be grassroots. That's the opposite of authentic. That's astroturfing. So, but like the new Twitter campaign is just massive outdoor billboards because digital companies know that outdoor is the last true broadcast medium. And these massive billboards and designed to be captured and shared, which all billboards should be, right? Billboards should be thought about as how do I get that into the social stream? That's the way you should think about using that money, right? To amplify it, because it's all about the amplification, because media is expensive increasingly, etc. But they're like, I love the posters. They're just tweets from people who are now famous, who weren't famous back when they tweeted saying, I'm going to be famous. And then they are famous now. Oh, that's nice, isn't it? It's like, because it sort of reverses a kind of dark thing people do on Twitter, which is go back through people's old tweets looking for things to take out of context to get them, in trouble, which is part of the cyber warfare that's occurring among the different parties in parts of the world.
Yes, and I think this is the part of the pyramid that I want to make sure people don't oversimplify. Is you're not saying that a certain channel is by its nature good or bad. It can be used in either way.
Except the lying ones. The lying ones are bad. Yes, there's no good or bad. There's just what do you need to achieve? Because the vectors across the pyramid, there's a couple of them, I think. One, which is agency. The more agency somebody has in an experience, the less able you can control it. So you're more and also speed. The media at the top, digital media, is extremely fast. You tend to get less attention on average in digital media, for sure, but you can deploy it at scale extremely quickly, which is very useful. Whereas multi-year sponsorships of the World Cup or a museum or something take a very long time to both do and to achieve the reach that you could have got much faster elsewhere. So it's about strategically understanding what you're trying to achieve, what your budget limitations are, and then what's the best way of doing that, whilst keeping in mind a sort of healthy respect for human attention. That's the thing I want to really get to, I guess, at the end, which is human attention, like a lot of things, once we realized it's valuable, became commoditized, or we tried to commoditize it, hence the attention economy thinking, right? And that's earlier. That came out originally in 1997, the article, a very prophetic article in Wired about the attention economy. Very, very prophetic about the internet leads you towards this because the internet is infinite and attention is not, right? So, but once you commodify something, you turn it into something you want to strip, mine, refine and sell, right? That's what we do with commodities. And human attention is literally the stuff of our life. Your experience of your life. This is what we're talking about, is your life and how you choose to allocate it, right? So I feel like a healthy bit of respect for that brought back in would lead to different effects, right?
Well, yeah, and you say some things that, perhaps people wouldn't expect. By its nature, the pyramid also has media in there that are long form. Mm-hmm. So you include things like an email newsletter, a book. Surprise, surprise. That you called that out right inside the book too. I love that. That these can, because they do tend towards that more virtuous, deep thinking, self-actualization that a person wants, that if you can, maybe move through the piranha tank end of the media pyramid as quickly as possible to find a person who will commit to those more cloistered, more reposed and longer forms of media, then you are on the right track to getting them to activate on your brand.
Yeah, and I think it's balancing it, right? Because brands need reach. One of the only things that we really, really 100% truly know is that reach seems to be very important, right? Yep. And it's how you get it and where you get it that becomes part of the challenge. And yes, there's going to be a funnel. I really like your thought, by the way. You just made me think that the pyramid could have a Maslowian pyramid of whatever upside down over the top of it. So at the bottom, it's more self-actualizing media. At the top, it's more base, like red in tooth and claw kind of, that kind of stuff. I might play with that. That's a good idea. Although it might look like a Star of David that way, which maybe
I don't know. Yeah, there's certainly different ways to play with the shapes. But the point is, you are offering some considerations. You don't get too prescriptive, and maybe we can just finish on this point. Is you resisted, I think, several times, just coming out and saying to people, "Okay, do it this way." Yeah. But maybe you could leave people with some of the biggest things that you want them to consider as they move into trying to pay for attention.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think principles last longer than practices, especially in the digital media environment. When I wrote this originally, change being accelerative is one of the things that we talk about a lot in the digital world, isn't it?
Makes it hard to write a book.
So it becomes out of date immediately, and the publishing cycle is 18 months to 2 years anyway. So you're like, it's already not right. So I wrote it intentionally like that. And it's designed to help you think, not tell you what to do. And if that's frustrating for some people, that's not my audience, I guess. The big part of it, I guess, is thinking about attention as this sort of many splendid thing with value to both parties, and how to try and add value to the whole kind of engagement piece with consumers is definitely part of it. I think being optimistic and empathetic with humans is really a big part of it, in terms of our customers, but also our colleagues and our clients. Because we're going through a really tough time, and we've been going through a really tough time for a really long time. And it's exhausting. And I think we all need that compassion. But I think thinking about attention as the thing, right? Thinking about media in quality terms first, rather than purely in cost terms, is generally a good reversal, I think. If you go cost first, you get the lowest possible CPM media that exists. So thinking about quality and kind of where you want your brand to show up, whilst also getting the scale that your reach needs to keep your business building, is the delicate balance. But I do think it's possible. And I also think there's going to be a creative renaissance to some degree, which is going to be triggered by the sort of deprecation of third-party cookies and HTTP on iPhone. So because the way the digital ecosystem has been constructed at an infrastructural level has been built on third-party tracking and data brokers sharing information about you, and that model is going away. We don't know what's going to replace it. As of today, Google announced they're not doing Flock anymore. They've got a new thing they're going to try. It's going to be complicated. But what we do know is that first-party data is going to be very important. We know what people have done on our sites. We know what they've done on retailers. Retailers know what they've done on their sites and their loyalty programs. That first-party data, big deal. But if you can't just endlessly optimize algorithmically, it leads you towards optimizing other parts of the system, and creative becomes an obvious one, which I think is generally probably a very good thing. That could be a great thing, actually.
I think it separates the grown-ups from the children. Let's face it, the things that led us to just a proliferation of data, the social networks. I will call out Facebook on this, that, allowed people with relative ease to pull back numbers that suggested that they were winning the marketing war. And there are even terms like that used. I think it was just because they were shooting fish in a barrel. They were able to get a data that really doesn't need to be there and can actually poison the well. It can cause the people on the receiving end of the media to say, I'm going to just get rid of this all. We're now in an age where it really is going to have to play to our right brain creative strengths.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's great. And I do think the lateralization thought is important. It's balancing those hemispheric tendencies between abstraction and emotion, if you like, at a very simplistic level. I do think that is the case. I do think clients started to collate data into massive data lakes, and they weren't really sure what they were doing with them. And all the email addresses were kind of locked into different brand databases and stuff and all that kind of thing for a while. And we kind of got stuck in this way of thinking about things that seemed just data is going to be good, so let's get all of it, like the NSA, and just, we need it later, we'll have it stored, But I do think it's going to change, and I think, it's an opportunity. It's a moment of both in terms of measurement of mass media and how digital is thought about. It's changing, and that could be a very good thing for kind of restricting some of the more negative externalities that the system has been able to produce, because these massive self-serve platforms can be manipulated in various ways. And I also think, to your point, creatively, it could be the beginning of a whole new way of thinking about digital, especially, or what digital is. Because it's everything. And, once you get that, then...
I think to boil it back to the title, it will make it will bring attention back to the rightful place of respect that we need to give it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think attention metrics are beginning to emerge in, I do a little bit of work with the Attention Council, which is a great multi-industry research and advertiser body looking at attention metrics and how they apply to trading currencies, either as optimization data using eye tracking and studies and so on. I think that's really interesting because it reminds us what we're doing, because that was the joke, right? The joke of my book is called Paid Attention. It's like a joke. So we buy and sell attention, but we're never sure if anyone's paying attention to the attention we paid for. And now maybe we might have a better idea, or at least begin to get a better idea.
I think so. I think you made me think about it, and I would encourage people to check out the book. Faris, if they wanted to find out more about it or about you and your agency, Genius Steals, where would you send them?
Absolutely. Well, the best place would be our newsletter. It goes out to about 13,000 marketers and ad people around the world every week. We write one issue and we curate a guest every single week because we think a plurality of voices is important. We want diverse inputs in our brain as much as we want to give diverse inputs to our audience and our clients. So Substack, geniussteals.co/subscribe will do it, or Substack. The web newsletter is called Strands of Soul and Genius. I am often available, as I mentioned before, on Twitter. I'm just at Faris, Faris, on Twitter. And geniussteals.co is where our nomadic creative consultancy lives. And we work across the kind of media industrial complex, actually, from brands with agencies, creative media, research, PR and beyond, digital, experiential, whatever you want. And then we also work with media companies, both digital and traditional, and media trade bodies like Thinkbox in the UK or Magnetic. So like across the entire value chain, which I think, and because we do it globally, I think gives us an unusually broad purview of the industry that we think helps us, because we try and build empathy between the best different parts. Empathy for clients, empathy for creatives, empathy for media. It's like, it works better that way.
I think that's what it takes in this day and age. And thank you again. And to my listener, thank you so much for listening to the end. I hope you got something of value. And if you would like to share this episode, I would be very grateful, because I think Faris's message needs to be heard by people who are trying to use media in the 21st century to reach their target audience. And I hope that you get something out of this episode that helps make your funnel even better.
Thanks for listening. Follow the show on Twitter at Funnel Reboot. If you like what you have heard today, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts.